Hey, and welcome to another Excel demo with Rich Kerr. In this scenario, we're going to be taking a look at a couple of different things um, that'll let us build a formula reusing a repetitive calculation in a simplified way. It's a way of sort of cutting down the clutter that we find in our Excel formulas. Here's the backdrop. I've got a list of products and their units sold in January and February. And so I want to show what the change has been in another column. And I want to express it as sort of increase, decrease, or say relatively unchanged or neutral. So what I want to do is if the increase is say greater than 10%, I want to call it an increase. If it's less than 10%, or let's say it has gone down by more than 10%, then we want to call that a loss. And then if it's less than 10% either way, we'll just call it no change. So first, I'm going to build an ifs formula. So the ifs function lets us do multiple logical tests. And what I'm going to do is evaluate the change from January to February. So we'll say C2 minus B2, and we'll take that quantity together. So I've got the C2 minus B2 in its own set of parentheses divided by B2. So that's going to show us the change from February to January. Now we want to say if that is greater than 10%, then we want to call this an increase. Okay, so if the change from January to February is greater than 10%, we want to call that an increase. Now, my second scenario is if it's less than a negative 10% change, we'll call that a decrease. So with the ifs function, I don't have to say if again or ifs again. I simply just write my next logical test, which is actually going to be, again, evaluating this change from January to February. But in this case, I'm looking to see if it's less than a negative 10%, right? And so if it's less than a negative 10%, we're going to call that, in fact, we'll call that a loss. And I think I'll call the other one a gain instead of increase. We'll call that a gain, and we'll call this scenario a loss. Now, the third scenario is if it's between, or let's say it's greater than or less than 10% change either way. Let's say it that way. So I want to take that same equation. I'm checking to see if the change from January to February, but I'm going to be evaluating the absolute value, right? Because it could be an increase or a decrease. So by putting that inside the absolute value function and then looking to see if that's less than or equal to 10%, then we're going to simply call that no change. Okay. So let's evaluate this. If the change from January to February is greater than 10%, we're going to put the word gain. If the change is less than negative 10%, we're going to put the word loss. And if the absolute value, meaning it could be, plus or minus, we're just going to take the absolute value amount and say if that's less than or equal to 10%, then we're going to call it no change. Okay. When we hit our enter key and we see, we call that a loss for February because we went down to 12,000 from 15,000. Now, if I had gone up to say 17,000, that would be a gain. Now, if I'd only gone to say 15,750, we call that no change because that's not 10%. That's within 10%. So we're calling that no change. 10% of 15,000 would be 1,500. So until I get to 16,500, it's still no change. Once I surpass that, then it's a gain, right? So we can see that our if formula is working, but look how heinous it is. And look how many times I have to say open paren C2 minus B2 divided by B2. I say that 3 different times in this formula. And this is where Excel's let function comes into play. The let function allows you to define a variable or a name or label and assign it to a calculation or a value. And then you can reuse that name throughout your formula. Here's how it could help us here. I'm going to say let, open paren, and then I'm going to say C2 minus B2 over B2. So that's my calculation. And but I want to let a name called change be associated with that. So it's let change, comma, and then I have this formula. Okay. So this first part here in my let function, I'm saying let this name be equal to this value. So let the word change be equal to C2 minus B2 over B2. So the beauty of that is I can now go throughout the formula and simply replace that equation with the word change. And I have three different places where we're doing that. Okay. So now it has simplified the formula. We can sort of read it a little bit easier now, saying if the change is greater than 10%, it's a gain. If the change is less than a negative 10%, it's a loss. And if the absolute value of the change is less than or equal to 10%, then we say no change. Now, of course, since we opened our formula now with the let function, so that has its own set of parentheses, we need a closing paren. And now it works. Again, it's the same result, except now I'm not repeating the whole C2 minus B2 over B2 part. So I just have it as change throughout the formula. And that's how the let function works. And I can now fill that down for the rest of the formula. So the let function allows me to replace this equation or value and just use a label or name. And in programming world, we would call this a variable, but you can refer to it as a name. In fact, that's how they reference it in the let function parameters. And you could actually have more than one name. You could continue to define various names and then use them in the rest of the formula. But in this example, I've just defined one name. It's called change, and it's equal to this value. Now let's do one more actually. Let's add another name to this equation. In every case, we are referencing 10% as this threshold. So I'm actually going to create a variable called threshold, or actually I'll just call it hurdle. Just make it a little shorter. So I'm going to call the name hurdle 10%. Okay, so now I have a second name, hurdle, and its value is 10%. So now throughout the rest of the equation where I had 10%, I can just say hurdle. Notice that hurdle even appears in the drop-down list of functionality when I'm entering it. So we want the negative hurdle here. Now, let's get back in and finish that. Negative hurdle. And here we would also have hurdle. So it still works. We just are using the word hurdle throughout the equation. So if change is greater than our hurdle, we call it gain. If change is less than negative hurdle, we call it loss. And if the absolute value of change is less than or equal to the hurdle, we say no change. Now the other advantage of that is, I'll go ahead and fill that down. The other advantage of that is we can now simply change the hurdle rate in one spot. So now I wanted to say maybe 20% is my threshold. I can just change it right here. I don't have to go and replace it throughout the rest of the equation because hurdle is now being set to 20%. And so that's going to have some differences. So now this is still saying no change for that first one because it doesn't cross the 20% threshold. So if I went up to say 18,000, still no change. If I go up to 19,000, now we have a gain because we're now exceeding 20%. So that's the other advantage. It means the editing can be a lot simpler down the line if you need to change some aspect of your formula, and if it's a value that needs to be represented multiple times or used multiple times, you now just have this one spot where you're defining what hurdle is, and I'm set to go, and I can fill that down. So that's how we can use the let function to create variables or names for our values and calculations and use that throughout our formula to simplify formula creation. I hope you found that useful. Please come back soon for more Excel demos with Rich Kerr. Peace.